So we'll talk about the origins of the Cold War. Hello, seniors. Today we're going to talk about the origins of the Cold War. This is one of my favorite topics in all of U.S. history. I think most of the work that I did when I was an undergraduate at the fine institution known as Whitman College is in the post-World War II American foreign policy. So I'm going to talk about how the Cold War started, some basic definitions, and then look at two documents that I think really lay the foundation for the entirety of the U.S. approach to the Cold War. So first, we have a couple definitions. The Cold War is ultimately a political and economic rivalry. It's a rivalry that's waged on using propaganda more than weapons. So it's really a battle between different economic systems, different political systems. There are two different ways that historians tend to explain the Cold War and how it started. The first one has to do with power, and the idea is that the Cold War was a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union as both sides were trying to gain as much power in the world as possible. The basic element behind this explanation is that power imbalances, as in the United States doesn't have enough power, created a fear of a rivalry that Moscow was taking power away from the Soviet Union. In that sense, how the leaders perceived world affairs, how people like Stalin or Truman perceived the other side, mattered a great deal for how the country perceived their relationships with one another. The second explanation is ideology, that the Cold War is a system of a battle between Soviet communism and American liberalism, and really it's this big conflict between whether or not democracy or a communist dictatorship would be the best economic and political system. The explanation of why it's cold is that there's really not a central military conflict between Russia and the United States from 1945 to 1990. There certainly is military conflict. The conflict goes on between what are called proxy powers. So you have conflict going on in Korea between the U.S. and armies that really involve both Korea and China, and then you have the U.S. and Soviet-backed North Vietnam fighting in the Vietnam War. So there is conflict going on, but the conflict is not directly between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's considered a war because everything that you have in a war, from the mobilization of weapons, the mobilization of troops, you have political conflict, propaganda, everything that constitutes a war happens except for the direct fighting between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. So the two documents that I want to look at are both from a guy named George Kennan, whose picture is here. George Kennan was a State Department official, and he was in Moscow in 1946. At the end of World War II, he was there, and he was one of the top officials that knew about the Soviet Union. He was asked initially by the Treasury Department, and then ultimately this goes to Truman. This message he gives goes to Truman. He was asked to comment on Soviet motivations during the time period at the end of World War II. He produces two documents about this. The first one is called the Long Telegram, and this is a telegram sent from Moscow to Washington, D.C. It's really long, which is why it's called the Long Telegram. Two main arguments in this: that the Soviet Union was expansive. They would attempt to expand their power whenever possible, and the Soviet Union perceived weakness as an opening for aggression. So he writes a telegram, no big deal. I think there's a fair argument that this long telegram in 1946 is the most important document written in the 20th century. That's a totally absurdly bold claim to make, but I think there's some defense for it, and the reason is that the long telegram and the subsequent public version of it that I'll talk about in a second becomes the basis for the entirety of American foreign policy from 1946 until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So everything the United States does during the entirety of the Cold War, our decisions in Korea, our decisions in Turkey, our decisions in Vietnam, our decisions in Latin America, come from the lens that Kennan sets up, a lens called containment. And so, in that sense, because this document is the blueprint for how the U.S. should act in every decision towards the Soviet Union, I think there's a fair argument to make that this is the most significant document produced, certainly after World War II, but in a sense, perhaps, during the entirety of the 20th century. So, he publishes the long telegram in 1946, but it's still a private communication. It's a message that goes from the State Department in Moscow to the office of the Secretary of State in D.C. Truman reads it and is persuaded by it. He then writes a longer article that was initially supposed to be given just to the Secretary of State. It becomes published in a magazine called Foreign Affairs, but it's published anonymously initially, just with the letter X on it. So it's called the X article. They are really awesome at labeling and diagramming and titling these documents, right? Long telegram, X article. This is classic. It doesn't get better than this. I went back on JSTOR a couple years ago and found the original version of the X article. This is the first paragraph of it, and it's called The Sources of Soviet Conduct. It's an article that really identifies Soviet ideology and the viewpoint that the Soviets have, and then Kennan outlines the response that the U.S. should make. I cut two sections out of this to show the response. So if the ideology is similar to the long telegram, it's an idea that the Soviet Union is expansive. They're attempting to balance the United States power and to reduce U.S. power wherever possible. So we have about 6-7 pages into the article, two sections that I wanted to highlight. The first one is on page 575. Kennan, this is the conclusion of the main first half of the article. He says, in these circumstances where the Soviet Union is expansive, it is clear that the main element of any United States policy toward the Soviet Union must be that of a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. So, in that sentence, he highlights the idea that becomes the basis for American foreign policy in the Cold War, and that is containment. So if you take one word out of this, that should be the word that you take out of this video, is containment. But there are some modifiers here. He's arguing that containment is not a short-term policy. It's not something we do once in 1947. It is a long-term policy that is patient but firm. And firm is significant because if the policy is weak, it will encourage Soviet aggression. I highlight the long-term element of this because Kennan goes on after 1950 to be a pretty big critic of American foreign policy, and he argues that the U.S. uses his ideas in ways that he didn't intend them, and he didn't mean this to be a long-term policy, but he did say it right there. The second part, this is the next paragraph, top of the next page. In light of the above, it will be clearly seen that the Soviet pressure against free institutions of the Western world is something that can be contained, right, there we are again, by the adroit and vigilant application of counterforce at a series of constantly shifting geographical and political points, corresponding to the shifts and maneuvers of Soviet policy. Several key elements here. The first one is he mentions containment again. He also drops your SAT vocab word of the day, adroit, which means astute or smart or tricky. And so the smart and vigilant application of counterforce. So we're always putting pressure on the Soviet Union. Where? A series of constantly shifting geographical and political points. So the question is, where do we put counterforce on the Soviet Union? The answer is everywhere. That containment is a global policy. We may be putting pressure on the Soviet Union in Turkey in 1 month, in Greece, but then in China or Korea in separate locations, separate times. So America is always willing to put pressure on the Soviet Union, and that pressure is corresponding to shifts in Soviet policy. So we're always adapting our policy to what the Soviet Union is doing. As I mentioned, this document, this paragraph right here and the paragraph right above it, becomes the two most important sentences that drive the entirety of U.S. foreign policy. And when we come back and we talk about the Vietnam War, in particular, I'll go back to Kennan again and again and point out how this policy gets implemented in different ways. So I hope the video was helpful and enlightening, and I will talk to you guys again soon. Go team.